Welcome to Haunted Voice Channel. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now, let's get started. I've always loved camping. There's something about being out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by trees and the sound of nature, that makes me feel alive. So when my girlfriend Sarah suggested a weekend trip to Devil's Hollow, I was all in. She'd heard about it from a friend who swore the place was haunted, but I figured it was just another ghost story. We packed our gear, loaded up the car, and set off for a quiet weekend in the woods. I wish we'd known what we were getting into. We arrived just before sunset. Devil's Hollow was as isolated as it gets, miles from the nearest town, with a thick canopy of trees that blocked out most of the light. As we set up camp, I noticed the air was different, heavy almost, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. But Sarah was excited, so I didn't mention it. We built a fire, roasted some marshmallows, and settled in for what we thought would be a peaceful night. It was around 10 p.m. when we heard the first sound, a low guttural growl echoing through the trees. I tried to brush it off, but Sarah looked at me, her eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, straining my ears, trying to figure out where it was coming from. That's when I saw him, a park ranger standing just beyond the edge of our campfire's glow. He looked out of place, like he didn't quite belong. His uniform was tattered and faded, and his skin, it was pale, almost gray. He didn't move, just stood there, watching us. "Can I help you?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. The ranger tilted his head, his eyes narrowing as he studied us. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "This place isn't safe, not after dark." "We're just camping," Sarah replied, her voice barely a whisper. "We're not causing any trouble." He took a step closer, and that's when I noticed his eyes. They were black, like pits, and they seemed to swallow the light. "You need to leave," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "The hollow isn't what it seems. It hungers." With that, he turned and disappeared into the trees, leaving us alone by the fire. I looked at Sarah, and she looked at me, both of us too stunned to speak. We laughed it off nervously, convincing ourselves that he was just trying to scare us. But deep down, I could feel the chill settling into my bones. We crawled into the tent, but neither of us could sleep. Every sound seemed amplified. Every shadow seemed to move. Around midnight, I heard it again. That same growl, only closer this time. I sat up, holding my breath, listening. The tent was filled with a tense silence, broken only by the soft rustling of leaves outside. Suddenly, there was a scratching sound, like claws raking against the fabric of the tent. Sarah grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice shaking. I reached for the flashlight, my hands trembling as I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the twisted trees and the shadows that seemed to dance around them. And then I saw it. A creature stood at the edge of our campsite, hunched over, its limbs impossibly long and thin. It looked like a man, but it wasn't. Its skin was stretched tight over its bones, and its face was a twisted, unnatural grin, too wide, too unnatural, like it had been forced into a shape it didn't belong in. And its eyes, those eyes were the same hollow black as the ranger's. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't listen. I was frozen, trapped in its gaze. The creature took a step closer, its grin widening, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. It opened its mouth, and the ranger's voice echoed out, distorted and wrong. "You didn't listen," it hissed. "Now you belong to the hollow." I backed into the tent, scrambling for the zipper, my hand shaking so badly I could barely close it. Sarah was crying, her face buried in her hands, and I knew we had to get out of there. I grabbed her arm, yanking her to her feet, and we bolted out of the tent, leaving everything behind. As we ran, I could hear footsteps behind us, heavy and fast, like it was right on our heels. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees twisting into unnatural shapes, their branches reaching for us like claws. I could hear that voice, the ranger's voice, echoing through the hollow, growing louder and louder. "You'll never leave," it taunted. "The hollow has you now." We ran until we could no longer hear it, our lungs burning, our legs numb. We didn't stop until we reached the car, collapsing into the seats, gasping for air. I started the engine and floored it, desperate to put as much distance as possible between us and that cursed place. We didn't speak the whole way home. Sarah stared out the window, tears streaming down her face, while I kept my eyes on the road, too afraid to look back. When we finally got back to town, we went straight to the police, hoping they could explain what we'd seen. But they just shook their heads, saying Devil's Hollow had been closed for years, ever since a park ranger disappeared without a trace. They said the woods were empty, that there hadn't been a ranger there in decades. I don't know what we saw that night. I don't know if it was the spirit of the ranger or something else. Something older, darker, that wears the faces of those who wander too far. All I know is that we barely made it out alive, and I know I'll never go back to Devil's Hollow. So if you ever find yourself in those woods and a ranger warns you to leave, take his advice. Because if you don't, you might just find yourself trapped in the hollow, forever haunted by those hollow black eyes. I've been a wilderness guide for most of my life, taking people on hiking, camping, and survival trips through some of the most remote parts of the Appalachian Mountains. But one night out there changed everything for me. I don't lead tours anymore. I don't even go near those woods. This is the story of why. It was early autumn and the leaves were just starting to change. I had a small group with me, 4 college kids looking for a thrill. They'd signed up for an advanced 3-day trek deep into the woods. They wanted the real wilderness experience. By day 2, they were loving it, full of excitement, snapping photos and pushing each other to go further. On the 3rd day, we set out early, planning to reach a lookout point that offered a view of the valley below. The trail was rugged and rarely used, but I knew it well. About an hour into the hike, I noticed something odd. The forest around us had gone quiet. Normally, you'd hear birds, insects, the rustling of small animals, but there was nothing. Just an unnatural silence that made my skin crawl. I brushed it off at first, thinking it was just the weather. But as we went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. I tried to keep my unease hidden from the group, but they picked up on it. One of the guys, Jake, asked if everything was all right, and I assured him it was, though I wasn't so sure. Around midday, we reached a small clearing. I suggested we stop for lunch, hoping that taking a break would help ease the tension I felt. While the group ate, I scouted around the edge of the clearing, trying to pinpoint what was bothering me. That's when I found it. There at the base of a large oak tree were footprints. But they weren't human, and they weren't from any animal I recognized. The prints were massive, larger than a man's hand, with elongated toes and deep claw marks at the tips. I knelt down to get a better look, and that's when I noticed the smell, a stench of rot and decay so strong it made my eyes water. I returned to the group, forcing myself to act normal. I knew whatever made those prints wasn't something I wanted to encounter. But before I could get everyone packed up, one of the girls, Emily, wandered over to where I'd been. I saw her freeze, staring at the tracks. She looked up at me, eyes wide with fear, and whispered, "What made those?" I didn't have an answer. I just told everyone we needed to keep moving, to stay close and not wander off the trail. We packed up quickly and pressed on, but the forest felt different now. It was as if the trees themselves were watching us, leaning in closer with every step. As the sun started to set, we came upon an abandoned campsite. It looked recent, maybe a few days old. The tent was ripped, and there were scattered belongings, a backpack, a few cans of food, a flashlight with dead batteries. But there were no signs of the campers, no bodies, no blood, just an eerie emptiness. The kids wanted to investigate, but I told them no. I could feel it, that growing sense of dread, clawing at the back of my mind. We kept walking, but I knew we weren't alone. I could hear faint whispers like voices carried on the wind, but distorted, unnatural. The trees seemed to close in around us and the trail became harder to follow. Then, as we rounded a bend, we saw it, a figure standing in the shadows just off the path. At first, I thought it was a man, but as it stepped into the dying light, I realized it was anything but. It stood about 7 feet tall, with elongated limbs and a hunched back, covered in matted fur that looked almost like it was rotting. Its face was a twisted mockery of a wolf's, but wrong, its mouth too wide, filled with jagged teeth, and eyes that glowed a sickly yellow. It let out a low growl, a sound that seemed to vibrate in my bones, and began to move toward us. I yelled for everyone to run, and we bolted, crashing through the underbrush, not caring where we were going as long as it was away from that thing. I could hear it behind us, crashing through the trees, impossibly fast. We stumbled into another clearing, and I realized with horror that we were back where we'd started, back at the ripped tent and abandoned campsite. It didn't make sense. We'd been running in a straight line, or so I thought. The creature was gone, but the silence was even worse than before. The kids were panicking, demanding answers I didn't have. That's when Emily pointed at the ground. The footprints, the same ones I'd seen earlier, were all around us, circling the campsite. And among them were fresh human footprints. But they didn't belong to any of us. I recognized them. They were from an old pair of hiking boots, the ones my dad used to wear before he disappeared in these woods years ago. I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. My dad had vanished on a trip just like this one. He'd never come back, and we never found a trace. I knew these woods like the back of my hand, but suddenly they felt foreign, like I'd never really known them at all. We didn't wait. We started moving, sticking close together, not daring to look back. But every so often, I'd see flashes of movement in the trees, a dark figure, keeping pace with us just out of sight. It felt like we were being herded, guided by some unseen force. By the time we finally broke through the tree line and saw the headlights of the van waiting at the trailhead, it was pitch dark. We didn't speak on the drive back. I dropped the kids off at their dorm and they thanked me in hushed voices, like they didn't quite believe what had happened. I never saw them again, and I haven't been back to those woods since. I left that life behind, but sometimes late at night I'll hear a low growl outside my window, or catch a glimpse of something moving in the shadows. And I wonder if that thing is still out there, waiting, or if my dad, wherever he is, ever found a way out. I've been a park ranger for almost 10 years, but this was the first time I'd been assigned to this remote section of the forest. It was supposedly one of the oldest stretches, untouched by time and seldom visited. No marked trails, no maps, just miles and miles of dense, tangled trees, the kind of place where light barely pierced through the canopy, and silence clung to everything like mist. They called it the Grey Woods, though no one seemed to know why. The rumors varied, from ancient curses to supernatural guardians protecting sacred land. I'd heard the whispers from the older rangers, but I'd always brushed them off. I wasn't one to buy into ghost stories. I believed in what I could see and what I could touch. That was until my first night alone out there. I set up my camp by a small, stagnant pond. The air was thick and heavy, like I was breathing in the woods themselves. As I settled in, I noticed the usual forest sounds were absent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just a deep, pervasive silence. It felt like the trees were watching me, their twisted trunks looming in strange, unnatural shapes. I tried to shake the feeling off. Maybe it was just the isolation getting to me. That night, as I lay in my tent, I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I realized there was a pattern to it. 3 slow, heavy knocks, like something was pounding the earth. I sat up, every muscle tense, and held my breath, listening. Another 3 knocks, closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, scanning the trees. There was nothing there, just darkness. The next morning, I found strange marks around my camp. They looked like large, clawed footprints. but they weren't like anything I'd ever seen. Too big to be a bear, too wide to be a wolf. I felt a chill run through me as I traced them around the campsite. Whatever had made those prints had circled me over and over as I slept. As the day went on, I kept hearing strange noises, low growls in the distance, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. By the time dusk rolled around, I'd convinced myself it was just the isolation. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me, but then I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond the tree line, something was watching me. It looked like a man at first, tall and thin, but when I focused on it, I saw that its limbs were too long, its movements too jerky, like a puppet on strings. It ducked back into the shadows as soon as I made eye contact. I tried to follow it, but as soon as I stepped into the tree line, the temperature dropped and the air turned thick and cloying, almost impossible to breathe. I felt like I was being swallowed by the forest, the branches closing in, the ground pulling at my feet. I forced myself back to camp, every step a struggle, like I was wading through quicksand. That night I didn't sleep. I sat by the dying fire, clutching my flashlight, eyes fixed on the darkness, waiting for it to return. When dawn finally broke, I knew I had to get out. I packed my gear in record time and started down the path I'd come from. But the woods seemed different, like the trees had shifted while I slept. Landmarks I remembered from the day before were gone, replaced by unfamiliar clearings and twisted paths. It felt like the forest itself was alive, leading me in circles, trapping me. That's when I heard the laughter, high-pitched and hollow, echoing through the trees. I spun around, trying to pinpoint the source, but it seemed to come from all directions at once. Shadows moved just beyond my vision, always just out of reach, shapes that flickered and shifted like smoke. Then I saw it again, that same figure from before, but closer this time. It wasn't alone. Standing beside it was another creature, hunched and covered in matted fur, with a face that was almost human but twisted into something monstrous. Its eyes were too large, too bright, filled with a kind of malevolent intelligence that made my skin crawl. I stumbled back and the world spun. I found myself on the ground, looking up at the canopy, and that's when I noticed something I hadn't before. Carved into the trees above me were symbols, strange runes that seemed to pulse with a faint, unnatural glow. They looked almost like faces, twisted into expressions of agony and fear. The ground beneath me started to shift, and I realized with horror that I was lying on a bed of bones, half buried in the undergrowth. I scrambled to my feet, my mind reeling. The trees around me seemed to twist and stretch, closing in, their branches reaching for me like skeletal fingers. I ran, blindly, through the forest, the laughter following me, echoing off the trees. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. My legs burned. My lungs felt like they were on fire. But I kept running until I broke through the tree line and collapsed onto the gravel road, gasping for breath. When I looked back, the woods were silent again, the darkness retreating like a bad dream. But I knew what I'd seen, and when I looked down, I realized I wasn't alone. Clinging to my shirt was a small carved wooden figure, identical to the symbols I'd seen on the trees. I don't know how I got out of those woods or what I encountered there, but sometimes late at night I hear the knocking again. 3 slow, heavy knocks just outside my door, and I know that the Greywoods haven't let me go. Not really. I left something behind and they won't stop until they've taken it back. So if you ever find yourself out there, alone in the woods, and you hear that sound, turn back. Don't look. Don't listen. Just run. Because once you see them, they never let you go. And trust me, you don't want to know what happens if they do. The forest was thick with fog, the kind that seemed to swallow up everything in its path. I was out for a weekend hike, hoping to clear my mind. But as I trudged deeper into the woods, an unsettling quiet settled around me. It wasn't unusual for the forest to be silent, but this was different. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, just an unnatural stillness that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. I'd always been fascinated by the legends surrounding this forest. Locals whispered of creatures that prowled its depths, things that took on the faces of those you knew. Skinwalkers, they called them. beings that could slip into the guise of anyone they'd laid eyes on. I never put much stock in it. Stories were just stories, right? That belief started to crack when I stumbled upon the campsite. It was eerily similar to mine. A green tent, a small fire pit, even a camp chair set up in front of it. I walked closer, feeling a strange sense of déjà vu, and that's when I saw the backpack. It was just like mine, down to the red stitching on the strap. A chill ran down my spine as I unzipped it, finding inside an exact replica of my gear. My water bottle, my map, my notebook with all my handwritten notes. Everything was there. I backed away, trying to make sense of it. Had I somehow gotten turned around and found my own camp? But no, mine was miles back. I knew that. I'd been walking for hours. I scanned the forest around me, and that's when I noticed the tracks. Hoofprints, but larger than any animal I knew of, pressed deep into the mud. They led away from the camp and into the trees, vanishing into the fog. I should have left right then. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to put as much distance between myself and that place as possible. But something compelled me to follow. A strange curiosity mingled with dread. I moved slowly, my footsteps muffled by the damp earth, and I soon realized I wasn't alone. I heard footsteps, soft, cautious, mirroring my own. I stopped, and so did they. I strained to see through the fog, but it was like a thick curtain, obscuring everything more than a few feet away. Then, a shape appeared. A human figure walking towards me. Relief flooded through me. Maybe it was another hiker, someone who could explain what was going on. "Hey!" I called out, my voice sounding hollow in the mist. The figure stopped, standing perfectly still. I took a step closer, squinting to make out details, and as I did, the fog seemed to pull back, revealing a face. My face. I stared, rooted to the spot as I looked at myself. It was like looking into a mirror, but wrong. The eyes were vacant, cold, like they belonged to something that didn't quite understand what it meant to be human. A twisted smile spread across its lips, and then it spoke, in my voice but off, like a poor recording. "You're lost," it whispered, tilting its head. "You shouldn't be here." I stumbled back, my mind reeling. How was this possible? I looked into the eyes of my doppelganger, and a sudden, irrational rage took over. I rushed forward, grabbing at it, but my hands passed through empty air. The figure dissolved into mist, reappearing a few feet away, grinning at me with a hollow, mocking expression. Panic surged through me, and I turned to run, crashing through the trees, branches clawing at my skin. I could hear it behind me, matching my every step, the sound of my own breathing echoing in my ears, louder and louder until I couldn't tell where my breaths ended and its began. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away, to escape whatever twisted reflection had crawled out of the fog. The forest felt endless, an inescapable maze, and the harder I ran, the more it seemed to close in around me. I glanced back, and there it was, gliding through the mist like a ghost, always a few steps behind, always watching with that sickening smile. My legs burned, but I forced myself onward, desperate to reach the edge of the forest, to escape this nightmare. Just when I thought I couldn't run any further, I burst into a small clearing. My heart stopped as I saw it, another campsite, identical to mine and the one I'd found before. The green tent, the chair, the fire pit. I looked around, disoriented, and then I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, sprawled on the ground, was my own body, motionless and pale, as if I had been lying there all along. I stumbled back, shaking my head in disbelief, but there was no denying it. I was looking at myself, dead, staring up at the sky with empty eyes. The mist began to close in around me, and I heard footsteps approaching. I looked up, and there it was, the thing that wore my face, smiling that horrible smile. It leaned down, close enough that I could feel its breath on my skin, and it whispered, "This is where you belong." And then everything went dark. When I opened my eyes again, I was back at the first campsite, my gear untouched, the morning sun filtering through the trees. For a moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare, but then I saw the hoofprints leading away into the forest. I packed up my things and left as fast as I could, never looking back. But sometimes when I close my eyes, I still see that face staring back at me, wearing my own skin, waiting in the fog for the next poor soul to wander too deep into the woods. And I wonder, just for a second, if maybe I never really left that forest at all. I'd been looking forward to this camping trip for weeks. Just me, the woods, and the stars, a break from the noise and the constant notifications. My buddy Tom and I packed up our gear and headed into the thick, dark heart of the forest. We knew this area was remote. In fact, that was the appeal. No other campers, no RVs, not even another soul for miles. Or so we thought. It was getting late by the time we arrived, the sun already dipping below the jagged tree line, casting long shadows across the dense undergrowth. The forest felt alive, humming with the low buzz of insects, the occasional rustle of unseen creatures. We found a spot to set up our tents near a small clearing, close enough to a bubbling creek that we'd have water, but far enough from the path that we'd be left alone. The first night was uneventful, almost peaceful. We drank, laughed, and watched the fire crackle until the embers turned to ash. I could have stayed there forever, listening to the calls of night birds and the quiet whispers of the wind in the trees. But as the hours wore on, the woods began to feel different. The noises seemed to grow louder, more deliberate, almost like footsteps crunching through the underbrush. I chalked it up to nerves and exhaustion, convinced myself it was just the usual forest sounds amplified by the stillness of the night. By the second night, things took a turn. It started with the smell. Around dusk, an unbearable stench filled the air, sharp and metallic like rotting meat mixed with sulfur. I'd never smelled anything like it. Tom noticed it too, wrinkling his nose and glancing around nervously. "Maybe there's a dead animal nearby," he muttered, but there was no conviction in his voice. We brushed it off and tried to settle in, but that night I had trouble sleeping. The woods were too quiet. It was as if everything, the birds, the insects, even the wind, had fallen silent. I lay there straining my ears, and then I heard it. A low growling so deep it seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath me. It was distant but unmistakable, a primal, guttural sound that sent a chill down my spine. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, peeking over at Tom's tent. He was awake too, his flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. "Yeah," he replied, voice barely above a whisper. "Probably just a wolf, right?" But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of doubt that I knew mirrored my own. We both knew wolves didn't growl like that. Not in this part of the country, and not with such a strange, almost human tone. The next morning, we decided to explore a bit, hoping the daylight would shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled over us. As we trekked through the forest, we came across strange marks on the trees, long, deep scratches gouged into the bark, like something had raked its claws through them. They were high up, far too high for any animal I knew of around here. "What the hell could have done this?" Tom asked, running his hand over the rough grooves. I had no answer, but the sight of those claw marks sent my stomach into a knot. I felt watched, exposed, like prey being stalked by some unseen predator. We pushed on, hoping to find signs of other campers or maybe even a ranger station. But the deeper we went, the more twisted and gnarled the trees became, their branches forming sinister shapes that seemed to reach out toward us. And that smell was back, stronger than ever, as if it were following us, clinging to our clothes and filling our lungs. By the time we stumbled upon an old abandoned ranger station, the sun was beginning to set, casting an eerie glow over the place. The building was in ruins, walls covered in thick moss and vines creeping through the broken windows. But we found something inside that made my blood run cold, a notebook, weathered and falling apart, stuffed into a drawer. Flipping through its pages, I saw scrawled notes about strange sightings in the area, mentions of dogmen and skinwalkers. One entry stood out: November 3rd. Saw something outside the station. Looked like a man, but the face was wrong. Too long, too narrow, eyes that glowed like embers. Heard it whisper my name, though I was alone. As I read that last line, I heard a noise from outside. A faint rustling, followed by a low growl. Tom and I exchanged a glance, and I could see my own fear mirrored in his eyes. We grabbed the notebook and bolted, sprinting back through the woods, our flashlights cutting through the darkness as shadows seemed to move all around us. We made it back to the camp, but by then night had fallen, and the forest was alive with sounds. Strange sounds. We tried to pack up quickly, but something was watching us. I could feel its eyes on my back, cold and malevolent. I turned around, and for a split second I saw it. A tall, gaunt figure standing just at the edge of the trees, its face obscured but its eyes glowing, burning red against the blackness. We abandoned everything, leaving the tents, our gear, even the fire still smoldering. We ran, crashing through the underbrush until we finally reached the path back to the car. As we sped away, I dared to look back, half expecting to see that figure chasing us. But the woods were empty, silent once more. It's been weeks since that night, but I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I catch a whiff of that smell, or hear a low growl in the distance. And last night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I thought I heard someone whisper my name, just outside my window. I got up to check, but there was nothing there, just shadows and silence. But somehow I know it's still watching. I don't usually get scared. I've been camping all my life, heard all the creepy stories, and dismissed them as the products of overactive imaginations. But after last weekend, I'm not so sure anymore. There are things in the woods, things that watch, things that shouldn't be there. And now, I know better than to doubt those stories. It was supposed to be a casual hike, just a day trip in the wilderness of Redwood Valley. The ranger station had warned me that some of the trails weren't well marked, but I had my map, compass, and plenty of supplies. I felt confident. I'd done this sort of thing countless times. The forest was dense, the trees impossibly tall and old, with thick moss covering every inch of bark. The air was damp and heavy, and the smell of wet earth was everywhere. As I walked, I noticed how quiet it was. There were no birds singing, no rustling in the underbrush, just an eerie silence that seemed to deepen the farther I went. A few hours into the hike, I realized I was lost. The trail had vanished, swallowed by the forest floor, and the landmarks on my map didn't match what I was seeing. I tried to backtrack, but the trees all looked the same, their towering trunks blending together in an endless maze. I took out my compass, but the needle spun erratically, as if it were broken. I told myself not to panic, to stay calm and keep moving, but the unease was starting to creep in. As I pushed through a particularly thick tangle of branches, I saw something odd, a pile of rocks, carefully arranged in a circle. At the center was a crude hand-carved totem, a twisted figure with empty hollow eyes. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen, and a chill ran down my spine. There were no signs of any recent human activity, no footprints, no cleared paths. And yet, the totem looked fresh, as if someone had placed it there recently. I decided to keep moving, hoping to find the main trail again, but the woods seemed to close in tighter around me, the silence pressing in on all sides. And then I started seeing them, glimpses of movement in my periphery, quick flashes of something darting between the trees. I stopped, straining to listen, but there was nothing. Just the stillness, the oppressive quiet. I tried calling out, hoping to scare off any animals that might be following me, but my voice seemed to die in the air, swallowed by the forest. That's when I heard it, a faint whispering sound like a low murmur. It seemed to come from all around me, echoing off the trees. I turned in circles, trying to find the source, but there was nothing to see, just endless trunks and shadows. And then I saw them. Eyes, dozens of them glowing faintly in the dim light. They were everywhere, hidden in the trees, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. They were set too high to belong to any animal I knew, and they seemed to blink in unison, as if they were all connected somehow. I backed away, heart pounding, and stumbled over a root, nearly falling. The eyes stayed fixed on me, never blinking, never wavering. I don't know what came over me, but I turned and ran. I sprinted through the trees, branches clawing at my face and arms, the underbrush tearing at my clothes. I could hear something following me, heavy footsteps crashing through the forest. I didn't dare look back. I just kept running, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would burst. After what felt like an eternity, I broke into a small clearing. In the center stood an old cabin, its wood gray and splintered, the windows shattered. I didn't think twice. I threw myself inside, slamming the door shut behind me. The interior was dark, musty, and filled with strange carvings on the walls, spirals and symbols that made my head spin. I tried to catch my breath, listening for any signs of movement outside. But the footsteps had stopped. Everything was quiet again, too quiet. I felt a presence in the room, a coldness that seeped into my bones. Slowly, I turned, and my heart froze. There in the corner was a figure. It was tall and gaunt, its skin stretched tight over its bones, with hollow, empty eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there watching me with an intensity that made me feel like prey. I don't remember leaving the cabin. I just remember running, stumbling through the woods, the daylight fading around me as I finally burst out onto a dirt road. I flagged down a passing car, barely coherent as I tried to explain what I'd seen. The driver gave me a skeptical look, but took me to the nearest town, where I finally felt safe. But I still see those eyes in my dreams. Every night, they're there, watching me from the darkness, waiting. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I can still hear that faint, whispering murmur, echoing in the back of my mind. It's as if the forest remembers me, as if those eyes are still watching, waiting for me to return. And I know deep down that if I ever go back, I won't make it out again. But I still see those eyes in my dreams. Every night they're there, watching me from the darkness, waiting. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I can still hear that faint, whispering murmur, echoing in the back of my mind. It's as if the forest remembers me, as if those eyes are still watching, waiting for me to return. And I know deep down that if I ever go back, I won't make it out again. I've been a park ranger for about 10 years now. I took the job because I liked the quiet, the solitude, the escape from the chaos of the outside world. The woods had always been my refuge, a place I thought I understood better than anything else. But there are parts of these woods, dark corners where the sunlight never seems to reach, that don't feel like they belong to the world I know. It started on an unseasonably cold night. My radio crackled with static, and dispatch called in with a report of strange noises near the northern edge of the park. Rumors had been floating around for weeks. Campers claiming they'd seen things lurking in the shadows, heard whispers that echoed through the trees, and strange tracks leading nowhere. I usually chalked it up to overactive imaginations, but tonight, something in the air felt different. It was thick, oppressive, and heavy with a chill that clung to my skin. I set out on foot, following the trailhead that cut through the heart of the forest. The moon was barely a sliver in the sky, and every step felt like it echoed a little too loudly, bouncing back at me from the trees. I walked deeper, letting the canopy swallow me whole. That's when I first heard it. A low, guttural growl, distant but unmistakable. I stood still, straining to hear. The growl came again, this time closer. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever encountered. It sounded wrong, twisted, like a creature trying to mimic a sound it had only heard once. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but I forced myself to press on, rationalizing it as a big cat or a bear. The deeper I went, the stranger things became. I noticed carvings on the trees, symbols I didn't recognize, crude shapes that seemed to pulse under my flashlight. They felt ancient, as if they'd been there long before I ever set foot in these woods. And then there were the smells: rotting meat, damp earth, something metallic, like blood left to bake under the sun. As I moved further, I started seeing things out of the corner of my eye, shapes shifting in the shadows, following me but never fully revealing themselves. I quickened my pace, but the creatures matched it, staying just out of reach, teasing me. I was no longer alone in the woods. I stumbled upon a clearing and froze. There in the center was a large stone circle, arranged like some kind of ancient altar. At first glance it looked abandoned, but then I saw it, a figure, crouched over, barely visible in the dim light. Its back was to me, covered in matted fur, its limbs unnaturally long and thin, twisted like they'd been stretched. I should have turned and run, but something in the back of my mind held me there, an inexplicable need to understand what I was seeing. As I watched, the creature slowly straightened, revealing a face that was neither animal nor human, its eyes dark voids that seemed to suck the light from the world around them. My breath caught in my throat as it turned fully, tilting its head as though it recognized me. "You came back," it rasped, and the voice was familiar, chillingly so. It was my own voice, mimicked back to me with an unnatural, hollow echo. Suddenly, memories that weren't mine began flooding my mind. Flashes of ancient rituals, blood-soaked ceremonies, and figures in cloaks chanting in a language I didn't understand. But somehow, I did. I felt an overwhelming sense of déjà vu, as if I'd been here before centuries ago. I stumbled back, gripping my head as the creature advanced, its gaze locked onto mine with a malevolent intelligence that seemed to reach into the depths of my soul. I broke free from the clearing, sprinting blindly through the trees, desperate to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever that thing was. But no matter how far I ran, the whispers followed, threading through the trees, wrapping around me like a noose. I burst out of the woods, breathless and trembling, but something was wrong. The landscape was the same, yet different. The trees seemed older, twisted, and the air felt denser, filled with a metallic taste that clung to my tongue. I glanced back, but the forest had closed in behind me as though swallowing the path I'd taken. I scrambled back to the ranger station, but when I reached the door, my reflection stared back at me through the window, and I barely recognized it. My face was gaunt, my eyes hollow, like I hadn't slept in days, but it was my eyes that terrified me most. They weren't mine at all. They were the creature's eyes, black and bottomless, as if something ancient was looking through them. Realization settled in, cold and unforgiving. The symbols, the memories, the creature. This was my connection to the woods, a dark lineage that had drawn me here long before I was born. I was not merely a visitor. I was a part of it, bound to the forest and the creatures within it. I felt a dark, twisted satisfaction, as if a piece of myself had been restored, even as I stood there, horrified. The whispers returned, stronger now, filling my head with thoughts that weren't mine, a hunger that wasn't mine. The woods had claimed me, and I understood finally that I would never leave. As I write this, the hunger grows, the moon will rise soon, and I can already feel my body beginning to change. There are others out there, waiting for me, calling me home. I thought I was a protector of these woods, but I was wrong. I am their prisoner, their offspring, cursed to roam these trees for as long as they stand, forever part of the whispers in the pines. I'd been camping dozens of times before, but this time was different. My friend Jake had convinced me to try a spot he'd heard about from his cousin, a hidden gem, he called it, way out in the backwoods of Hallowpine National Park. It wasn't on any map, he said, and barely anyone knew about it. We set out early, hauling our packs through trails that were barely visible. The forest here felt dense, almost claustrophobic, and the air was thick with the scent of moss and damp earth. It was only midday, but a hazy gloom hung over the woods, making it feel like dusk. I tried to shake off the unease that seemed to cling to me as we trekked deeper into the trees. We reached the spot around mid-afternoon, a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, with a strange stillness that immediately made me uncomfortable. I couldn't hear any birds or even the rustle of animals, just silence so heavy that it felt like a weight on my chest. As we set up camp, Jake started talking about a local legend his cousin had told him about, the Echo. According to the story, there was something that lived in these woods, something that could mimic voices perfectly. People said if you stayed out here long enough, you'd hear it calling to you, sounding exactly like someone you knew. "You think it's real?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but the hair on the back of my neck was already standing up. Jake shrugged, a grin spreading across his face. "Who knows? We'll find out, right?" As the sun dipped below the tree line, we built a fire, its glow casting long shadows that danced among the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was that uncanny sensation of eyes following your every move, though when I looked around there was nothing there, just the trees standing tall and silent, like an audience waiting for the show to start. We talked and laughed, but my mind kept drifting back to the legend. After a while, Jake decided to hit the tent, leaving me alone by the fire. I wasn't ready to sleep, so I stayed up, staring into the flames. The night around me felt thick, the silence broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire. Then I heard it. "Adam," a voice soft and distant just beyond the firelight. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. It sounded like Jake, but he was in the tent, asleep. I called out, "Jake, you okay?" Silence. I stood up, grabbing my flashlight, and scanned the trees. "Jake?" I called again, louder this time. That's when I heard it again, clearer now, like it was right next to me. "Adam, over here!" It was Jake's voice, unmistakable, but it was wrong somehow. Too smooth, too perfect, like someone imitating him. A chill ran down my spine, and I shone the flashlight around, desperate to see what was out there, but there was nothing, only trees and shadows that seemed to stretch and twist in the light. Then from behind me, I heard the zipper of the tent. I spun around, shining my flashlight on Jake as he crawled out, rubbing his eyes. "What's going on?" he asked, looking as confused as I felt. "I heard you calling me," I stammered, "but it wasn't you." He frowned, glancing into the woods. "The Echo," he whispered, his voice barely audible. We sat back to back by the fire, every muscle in my body tense as we listened to the night. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. The silence was suffocating. I was about to suggest going back to the tent when I heard it again. "Jake." The voice floated out from the darkness, soft and sweet, like a lullaby. I glanced at Jake, but he was as pale as I felt, staring into the trees. The voice came again, closer this time. "Jake, over here." "It sounds like my sister," Jake murmured, his voice trembling. "That's impossible," I hissed. "She's back home." But the voice persisted, calling to him, coaxing, sounding so much like his sister that I saw Jake's resolve start to crumble. He stood up, taking a step toward the trees. "Jake, don't." I grabbed his arm, pulling him back. He looked at me, his eyes wide and scared. "I don't understand. How is this happening?" Suddenly, from the other side of the clearing, we heard my voice echo back to us. "Jake, don't." It was my voice, but cold, empty, like it came from a recording. I clutched Jake's arm, every fiber of my being screaming to run. The voices began to multiply, blending together in an unnatural symphony. Jake's sister, my mother, Jake's voice, all mixing and merging, calling out from every direction. It was like the forest was alive, breathing out memories and twisting them into something unholy. I could barely think over the sound of the voices, but I grabbed Jake, yanking him toward the trail. We stumbled through the trees, branches clawing at us like bony fingers trying to hold us back. The voices followed us, growing louder, closer, until it felt like they were inside my head. Finally, we burst out onto the main trail, gasping for air. The voices stopped, and the silence returned, heavier than before. We didn't speak as we hurried back to the car, every step feeling like a race against the unseen thing lurking in the woods. As we drove away, I glanced back at the dark outline of the trees. I could still hear the echo of those voices, whispering through the night, calling to me. We never spoke of it again, but I can't shake the feeling that the echo followed us home. Sometimes, late at night, I hear my own voice calling out from the shadows. I haven't told anyone, but I know what I heard. And I know it's still out there waiting for me to answer. I'd always heard stories about the Watcher's Wood, but I never took them seriously. It was one of those places that locals loved to talk about, a dense patch of forest where strange things supposedly happened. There were tales of people hearing voices, seeing figures in the trees, and of campers who never made it back out. But you know how it is? Those stories always felt exaggerated, told to scare the younger crowd or keep thrill seekers away. I'm not easily scared, and I liked a good adventure. So, when I finally got some time off, I figured I'd head out there and see what all the fuss was about. I'd camped alone plenty of times, and the thought of spending a couple of nights in the infamous Watcher's Wood intrigued me more than it scared me. I packed light, tent, a good amount of food, a flashlight, and my journal. I drove out to the edge of the forest and hiked in. It wasn't on any official trail, but I had a general idea of where to go, thanks to some old maps I'd found online. As I got deeper into the woods, the trees grew thicker, their branches twisting overhead, blocking out most of the sunlight. By the time I reached the clearing I'd picked as my campsite, it was late afternoon, and the place was dead quiet. No birds, no insects, just silence. I brushed off the unease in my gut, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me. I set up my tent by a small creek, the only sound coming from the water trickling over the rocks. It felt peaceful at first, the kind of peace that comes with being completely cut off from the world. As night fell, the quiet became oppressive. It was the kind of silence that presses in on you, making you hyper-aware of every small noise you make. The wind barely moved through the trees, and the stars overhead seemed faint, like they didn't want to witness what might come. I lit a fire, hoping it would ease the tension, and I started cooking some dinner. That's when I heard it. The first sign that something wasn't right. A soft rustling in the trees. At first I figured it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the sound was too deliberate. It wasn't the scurrying of something small. It was slow, measured, like footsteps. I stood up, shining my flashlight toward the sound. Hello? Anyone out there? Nothing. The beam of light only showed trees and underbrush, shadows dancing as the fire flickered behind me. I scanned the woods for a few more moments before sitting back down, trying to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me, nothing to worry about. People camped here all the time, right? But the uneasy feeling only grew. As I sat by the fire, I started hearing something else. It was faint at first, almost like the wind, but there was no wind. It was a voice, low and distant, coming from deep within the forest. I strained to listen. It was a woman's voice, or at least it sounded like one, but I couldn't make out the words. They were garbled, distorted, almost like they were being whispered underwater. My skin prickled as the voice grew louder, still unintelligible but undeniably there. It sounded like it was calling out, searching for someone or something. I grabbed my flashlight again, shining it into the dark. "Who's there?" The voice stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was even worse than the voice. My heart was pounding now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned slowly, scanning the forest for any movement, but saw nothing. Just the tall, looming trees casting long, eerie shadows. I sat back down by the fire, my nerves on edge. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe the isolation was getting to me more than I thought. I was alone out here after all. It's easy to hear things that aren't there when you're alone. But that was when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Footprints, and not mine, fresh ones. They were in the soft dirt just outside the circle of light from my fire. I hadn't noticed them before, but there they were, leading from the edge of the forest to the spot where I had been sitting. Bare footprints, like someone had walked right up behind me, stopped, and then vanished. My throat went dry and I felt my pulse quicken. Something, had been there, just moments ago, standing right behind me, watching. I backed up toward the tent, grabbing my pack and pulling out the small hatchet I always carried with me. My flashlight beam swept across the clearing again, but there was nothing, no one. Just the dark, silent forest, staring back at me. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but the hike out would take hours, and it was pitch black. I wasn't about to navigate the dense woods at night with whatever was out there lurking in the trees. So I did the next best thing. I stoked the fire, kept my flashlight close, and sat there waiting, listening. For a long time nothing happened, just the crackle of the fire and the sound of my own breathing. But as the night wore on, the feeling of being watched never left. Every now and then, I'd hear the faintest shuffle of leaves or a soft footstep just beyond the reach of the firelight. Around midnight, the voice returned. It was clearer now, louder, as if whoever or whatever was speaking had moved closer. This time I could make out the words. It was a woman's voice, soft but insistent. "Help me." The words sent a chill down my spine. I stood up again, gripping the hatchet tight, my flashlight flicking from tree to tree. "Who's there? Where are you?" No answer. Just silence, thick and suffocating. But I could feel it now. Eyes watching me from the dark, just beyond the reach of the light. I didn't know what was out there, but I knew it wasn't human. No person moves that quietly. No person leaves footprints without a trace, and no person just disappears. I stayed up the entire night, sitting by the fire, every muscle in my body tense. I didn't sleep, didn't blink, just listened to the occasional shuffle of movement in the trees and the faint, distant voice calling for help. As soon as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I packed up what I could, threw the rest of my gear into the tent, and hiked out of there as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I made it back to the car. When I got home, I tried to tell myself that I'd imagined the whole thing, that the isolation had gotten to me, or that the stories about Watcher's Wood had planted something in my mind. But a week later, I pulled out my pack to clean it, and I found something that still makes my skin crawl. A single, long strand of dark hair, twisted, tangled, and knotted around the strap of my backpack. I don't have dark hair. I don't know anyone who does. And I've never been back to Watcher's Wood. I don't plan to. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, just me, the trees, and the crackling of a campfire. I needed the break. Work had been relentless, and I thought a weekend alone in the woods would clear my head. You know, reconnect with nature, find some peace. The drive took me deep into the mountains, far from the city's noise, far from everything really. I didn't want the usual crowded campgrounds, so I found a spot online, a secluded site off the beaten path, a place where I could really disconnect. No cell service, no other campers, just solitude. It sounded perfect. I arrived just before dusk. The forest was already quiet, almost unnaturally so. It felt like the trees were holding their breath, waiting for nightfall. But I shrugged it off. This is what I came for. I set up my tent, got a fire going, and settled into my chair with a book. The sound of the fire crackling was soothing, a welcome change from the constant hum of the city. But as the night deepened, that peacefulness began to feel wrong. It started small. A faint rustling in the bushes, like something was moving around just beyond the tree line. I figured it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the sounds didn't stop. They circled the campsite, slow and deliberate, as if whatever it was watching me. I told myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As the fire dimmed, the woods grew darker, the kind of darkness that swallows you whole. I stoked the fire and tried to read, but my eyes kept drifting to the shadows just beyond the light. That's when I heard it. A whisper. At first I thought it was the wind, but it was too distinct, too human. Words I couldn't make out, carried on the breeze. I froze, straining to hear, but the whispering stopped. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I scanned the darkness, but there was nothing, just the firelight flickering against the trees. I decided it was time to turn in. Maybe I was just letting my mind get the better of me. After all, I was out here alone, in unfamiliar territory. My tent felt like a safe haven, a thin barrier between me and whatever was out there. But that feeling didn't last long. In the dead of night, I woke to a sound, a low guttural noise like breathing. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. I lay there, holding my breath, listening. The sound grew louder, more defined. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate. Crunching through the underbrush. Something, or someone, was out there. My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to believe it was just an animal, but deep down I knew it wasn't. I could feel it. Something was wrong. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, moving as quietly as I could. My hands were shaking as I stepped out into the cold night air. The fire had long since died, leaving only the faint glow of embers. I swung the beam of my flashlight across the trees, my breath coming out in sharp, panicked gasps. Nothing. But that's when I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of my light, stood a figure. Tall and unmoving. It looked like a person, but something was off. Its limbs were too long, its posture too rigid, and its eyes, God, its eyes glowed in the dark, reflecting the beam of my flashlight like an animal's. But it wasn't an animal. It was watching me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My mind screamed at me to do something, but I was frozen, locked in place by those glowing eyes. Then, without warning, it started moving toward me. Not walking, gliding. Its movements were unnatural, jerky, like a puppet on strings. And the whispering returned, louder this time, more insistent. The words were clearer now, but they didn't make sense. They were wrong, twisted, like someone speaking a language that didn't belong in this world. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet as I fumbled for the tent zipper. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely grip it. I finally managed to get inside and zipped it up, but I knew it wouldn't help. That thing was out there, just beyond the thin layer of fabric. I could hear it now, moving around the tent, its breath rasping in the darkness. I held my breath, waiting for it to come inside, to tear through the canvas and drag me out. But it never did. The footsteps circled the tent again, slower this time, more deliberate, like it was toying with me. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the sound stopped. Silence. Deafening, suffocating silence. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I just sat there clutching my flashlight, waiting for the sun to rise. And when it finally did, I packed up as fast as I could and got the hell out of there. But as I threw my gear into the car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were no tracks, no footprints, nothing to suggest anyone or anything had been there at all. The ground was undisturbed, as if I had imagined the whole thing. But I hadn't. I knew what I saw. I sped out of those woods, my heart pounding, my mind racing. But the further I got from that campsite, the more things didn't add up. I kept thinking about that thing, the whispers, and those eyes. And then it hit me. I wasn't alone when I got there. I had passed a sign just off the trail before I found my spot. It was old, worn down, but I remember what it said now. Campground closed due to unexplained disappearances. This place wasn't on the map by accident, and as I sped down the mountain road, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me from the trees.